My name is Andres Delgado. I was born in Honduras. And I was on the verge of losing everything I had. My career as a soccer player. My own life. And the most precious thing I held, my soul. I still have that day etched in my memory as if it had happened yesterday. That disturbing and momentous encounter with Satan himself. Up until that moment, I had firmly believed that every drop of sweat shed in the tough training sessions, all the sacrifice invested in soccer, would sooner or later lead me to absolute success. But I never imagined that this supposed triumph would be my doom. My story is peculiar, I admit it, and I tell it with absolute frankness, with the sincere intention of serving as a warning to those who may see themselves reflected in it. It all happened one particularly exhausting night, after a strenuous training session that had left me exhausted that night. An indescribable feeling began to take hold of me. Something unusual, a deep emptiness and an overwhelming loneliness. It was as if my soul was teetering on the edge of a dark abyss, trapped between two opposing forces. As I lay down, suddenly, I was transported to a terrifying place whose existence I hadn't even contemplated. At first, I felt confused and bewildered, but when I realized where I was, I felt my heart stop completely. I was in hell. The atmosphere around me was dense, suffocating, almost palpable, and the extreme heat penetrated to my bones. The ground was burning, and hellish flames rose violently like raging serpents while the desperate screams of tormented souls flooded all around. Sweat trickled down my forehead. But I was so terrified that I felt paralyzed, unable to move. Even 1 centimeter in the air hung an unbearable, nauseating smell that smacked of something deeply corrupted and in an advanced state of decomposition. Just then, an imposing figure appeared before me, an evil presence with eyes as deep and dark as a moonless night. His smile was disturbing, cruel, and mocking, completely devoid of humanity. "Did you think football would take you to glory?" he asked me, his voice so deep it seemed to echo in my very core. I wasn't able to articulate a word. I felt like my soul had been trapped in that terrible void. Satan looked at me with a malicious smile and began to reveal the true price of success. "I will offer you everything you've always dreamed of," he murmured as his silhouette slowly faded into dark shadows. "Power, fame, wealth. Any wish can be yours, on the sole condition that you follow my path." His voice was like a seductive melody that caressed my ears, offering irresistible pleasures that any soccer player would covet with all his might. Tempting images paraded before me, glorious victories in major matches. Full stadiums chanting my name in unison. My face plastered on the most prestigious covers. $1 million contracts and a life overflowing with luxury and comfort. Scenes I had barely glimpsed in my most ambitious dreams. However, as I contemplated those wonderful promises, something inside me resisted a subtle intuition that insisted on telling me that something wasn't right, that it wasn't true success. In the midst of the internal battle, I suddenly remembered the words spoken by Jesus in the desert when he faced the temptation of Satan, who also offered him absolute power if he agreed to worship him not by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. This sacred phrase awakened a deep and necessary doubt in my spirit. Was that really what I wanted? To gain fame in exchange for losing my soul? To calm my hesitation, Satan fixed his gaze on me with intensity and contempt. "You are nothing more than a weak man," he stated in an intimidating tone. "You will not be able to achieve anything without my help. The world will never allow you to succeed unless you follow my rules." His objective was clear. He wanted to make me feel insignificant and powerless in the face of his offers, but to both of our surprise, deep within me, something began to resist with a determination that not even I understood at that moment. Then, suddenly, an intense and brilliant light broke through the darkness that surrounded me. An angel descended from heaven, and although his face remained hidden, his presence emanated infinite serenity and peace. "Do not be afraid," he proclaimed with a heavenly and powerful voice that pierced to the very depths of my heart. "What Satan offers you is ephemeral and temporary. True victory resides in the Lord. With the little breath that still remained in me, I asked him desperately, "What do you offer me? What can I do to finally escape this terrifying darkness?" The angel slowly raised his hand, and from it words flowed that resonated powerfully in my soul. "Write in your heart what the scripture says. What does it profit a man to gain the whole world yet forfeit his soul?" His deep voice, filled with an indescribable peace, brought with it a revelation that forever transformed my perspective. In that instant, I clearly understood the difference between true glory and the false success the world was offering me. The angel showed me that Satan was only capable of offering me something temporary, a fleeting mirage disguised as happiness, football, fame, money, and recognition. All of that, no matter how bright it seemed, was nothing but ephemeral smoke destined to dissipate there. In the midst of that vision, I discovered that there was a reward far greater and more valuable than all those false treasures, the eternal peace that only God could offer me. I closed my eyes tightly, silently offering a sincere plea for forgiveness for having come so close to giving into that fatal temptation. When I opened them, hell was no longer in its place. I found myself back in my room, trembling, my body drenched in cold sweat, but with a spiritual clarity I had never experienced before. That night, something profound changed in me irrevocably. Upon returning to soccer, I discovered that my purpose had radically evolved. I no longer entered the field motivated by the selfish desire to become the best player in the world, but rather driven by a genuine and honest desire to glorify God through every play, every game. The result on the scoreboard ceased to matter. Now, what truly mattered was my attitude on the field and the example I could set for those watching. My heart, which once beat with personal ambition, was now moved by a deep desire to serve others. I still retain the angel's words clearly engraved in my memory, because everything in the world, the desires of the flesh, the desires of the eyes, and the pride of life do not come from the Father but from the world. That powerful truth became my spiritual compass. Soccer ceased to be the central axis of my existence, giving way to my faith. True victory was no longer measured by medals or trophies accumulated but by the firmness and consistency in my beliefs. Although I had overcome that initial temptation, I soon understood that the spiritual battle never ceased. Satan was always lurking, looking for new and subtle ways to divert my attention from my true purpose. Every time I stepped onto the field, I reaffirmed within myself that I was there to honor God and not to pursue my own glory. When I look back now, I feel no regrets whatsoever. On the contrary, I feel profound gratitude for having discovered what truly matters. My success stopped residing on the soccer fields and began to focus on my relationship with God, in the absolute certainty that my soul was safe in His hands. Despite this renewed clarity, the temptation never ceased to be strong, but I discovered something even more powerful, the inexhaustible strength of God, who would always accompany me on the right path. I want to leave these words engraved in your heart so that you never forget what success truly is. The world passes and its desires, but he who does God's will remains forever. A few days after experiencing this revelation, I felt a commotion within me begin. An even more intense struggle, although I returned to the field with a renewed and strengthened spirit. Temptation continued to await me around every corner. The media, fame, and wealth constantly insisted on offering me seductive promises of immediate satisfaction and apparent fulfillment. However, every time I faced these opportunities, something deep within me clearly warned me that I could not allow my heart to fall back into that destructive trap. Commercial offers arose everywhere, multiplying day after day and constantly testing me. Big brands began to seek me out with increasing insistence. They wanted me to be the main image of their products. As a result, I saw my bank account grow considerably every day. My teammates around me often congratulated me, expressing how fortunate I was to have achieved this success, apparently so desired by many. However, despite all this, I could not find peace within myself. A piercing question constantly echoed in my mind: why was it so difficult to maintain integrity? A world that seemed to reward the opposite. One night, after a particularly grueling workout, I stayed in my room, alone and immersed in my thoughts. The room was silent, but the voices of worldly success continued to resonate in my head, like persistent echoes trying to draw me toward a path whose consequences I already knew. I slowly approached the mirror, carefully observing my reflection, and I could perceive a strange and disturbing emptiness in my own eyes. At that very moment, I remembered again the angel who had appeared before me in that dark episode, and his words returned forcefully to my memory. True glory is not in worldly success, but in following the path of righteousness and faith. I understood then with absolute clarity that I could no longer lead that double life. It was not possible to continue playing by the world's rules while claiming to live for God. The words of Christ resonated deeply in my conscience. No one can serve two masters. The internal struggle was intense and exhausting, but the decision I had to make was equally real and urgent. I knew perfectly well that I could not allow myself to continue along the path Satan offered me, even though all external pressures tried to push me in that direction. The next day, before going out to play a decisive match, while I was preparing in the locker room, one of the team's most veteran players approached me. With an arrogant smile and a contemptuous tone, he gave me some advice laden with cynicism. If you really want to reach the top, you'll have to forget all that nonsense about morality and religion. In this sport, there's no room for weakness. His words touched very sensitive nerves in me, penetrating deeply. But surprisingly, instead of generating more doubts, I felt something different inside. It wasn't confusion, it was certainty. At the precise moment the referee's whistle blew to start the game, something inside me was activated with unusual force. The words written by the Apostle Paul in Ephesians 6:12 came to mind with absolute clarity. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the princes of the darkness of this world. At that very moment I understood that my battle it wasn't just physical on the field, but primarily spiritual. The enemy was determined to derail my resolve and weaken my faith, but I knew I had to remain steadfast and resist any temptation that crossed my path. The game proceeded normally, with adrenaline pumping intensely through every vein. However, this time, something different happened inside me. I was no longer worried about the outcome of the game, whether I won or lost. My only concern was to play sincerely, with all my heart, giving my best, not for personal recognition, but to honor God in every action. Every pass, every goal, and every play, I made with the certainty that if I remained faithful, the final result would depend entirely on divine will and not solely on my abilities or efforts. As the days passed, the inner conflict continued, but at the same time, something began to change profoundly within me. The business offers continued to arrive, but they no longer held the same seductive power over my heart. Now, I could clearly distinguish that everything the world offered was temporary, illusory and superficial. I felt more and more strongly that I was being called to lead a different life, an existence that did not depend on the constant applause of the crowds but was based on the living testimony of my faith. I particularly remember one afternoon after returning exhausted from a very demanding game when I passed an elderly man on the street walking slowly toward me. He didn't know me or know anything about my life. The man approached me with a serene look and said to me in a firm but compassionate voice, "Son, don't follow the path the world offers you. You have a much greater purpose than fame and money." Those words reached my heart with the force of a revelation, confirming that God continued to send me clear and powerful messages, carefully guiding me toward the right path. His words pierced my heart like a sure arrow, making me aware that God continued to speak to me continuously using mysterious means that I had to learn to listen to carefully. That very night, I felt the urgent need to seek refuge in the scriptures. I opened the Bible in Psalm 37:4 where I remained for hours meditating deeply on its words. Delight yourself in the Lord, and He will give you the desires of your heart. Then I clearly understood that my life could no longer revolve around my selfish desires but should focus solely on doing God's will. The glory the world promised turned out to be superficial and empty compared to the eternal glory from the Lord. The days that followed confronted me with constant and renewed temptations. My name continued to appear frequently in the media, and commercial offers continued to arrive, each one more attractive than the last. However, this time my response was different. Instead of being swayed by them, I began to make wiser decisions, grounded in my faith. I chose to invest my time in helping others, especially those who needed it most. Finally, I understood that true success lay not in my personal achievements but in what I could contribute to those around me. This is how my faith began to direct each one of my favorite things, not only on the field but also in my daily life. Was one afternoon, after a particularly demanding game, a young man timidly approached me and said with genuine curiosity, "I've been watching you closely, and I notice something different about you. You're not like the other players. What's your secret?" Without hesitating for a moment, I smiled and sincerely replied, "My secret is simply everything I am and everything I do is for God." Those words were a strong personal reminder that my life was no longer my own, but belonged completely to the one who had given me everything. From that moment on, my life began to change radically in ways I had never imagined. I was no longer driven by my ego or personal ambitions, but motivated solely by the genuine desire to serve and please God. It mattered little whether I was considered the best player or if I went unnoticed on my team. What was truly valuable to me was knowing that I was fulfilling God's will. I finally understood that true success consisted of having peace in my conscience, knowing with certainty that I was walking the path God had especially prepared for me. However, the spiritual battles did not cease. From time to time, thoughts of pride and vanity still tried to invade my mind, but each time this happened, I returned to firmly clinging to the scripture that already dwelled in my heart, "Whoever wants to be great among you shall be your servant." It was precisely in the humility of serving others that I discovered my greatest strength. I clearly understood that life would never be easy and that trials would always be present, but true victory could never be measured by trophies or recognition. True victory lay in living in full obedience to God when our purpose went beyond the material and drove us to selflessly serve others. Every time I stepped onto the field, I no longer saw my teammates as rivals to be overcome, but as brothers united by a common purpose. Playing with integrity, honoring God and serving with a sincere heart, soccer ceased to be just a sport, it became a means to share the gospel. Showing with every action that true success lies in following and fulfilling God's will. Today I am fully aware that the enemy will never stop trying to derail our path. However, I have learned that no matter how hard or intense this struggle is, as it is written in Philippians 16, "He who began a good work in you will carry it on to completion until the day of Jesus Christ." No matter how many times we fall, the essential thing is to get up, continue moving forward with our faith intact and always trusting that our destiny is in God's hands. Even though my days continued to be filled with challenges, my inner self had already undergone a definitive transformation. Every time I faced the pressures derived from fame and the world's expectations, I felt the supernatural strength of my faith holding me firmly and helping me resist. The media continued to insistently pursue me. They wanted to turn me into the perfect image of the sports idol that the public so yearned for. However, time and again, I found myself rejecting proposals that in the past I would have accepted almost without thinking about them. I knew with absolute certainty that my life no longer belonged to that ephemeral and superficial world. On one occasion, during a press conference, a journalist approached me directly with a pointed question, "Andres, why do you think you're doing so well now? Many claim that your success is due to your discipline and talent, but we feel there's something more behind it." From all of this, without hesitation and spontaneously, I responded, "My success is not due solely to me, everything I have achieved has been thanks to the grace of God." After those words, the cameras fell silent for a moment, and a deep silence filled the room. I clearly felt the atmosphere change, as if my words had touched something deep in those present. It was clear they hadn't expected to hear something like that, but it was exactly what many needed to hear. That same night, when I got home, I prostrated myself in prayer before God, deeply grateful for having given me the courage to speak honestly. In front of everyone, I knew that the temptation to seek personal recognition and glory was still strong. But now something more powerful dwelled within me, the firm desire to live according to God's will. Often, the spiritual struggle seemed endless. But in those intense moments of prayer, I found an indescribable peace. I always remembered Christ's promise written in Matthew 6:33, "Seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and all these things will be added to you." That promise became a profound comfort in the midst of any difficulty. As time went by, I discovered new ways to use my fame for the common good. I left behind lavish events and unnecessary expenses and instead began donating a significant portion of my income to charitable organizations. I began visiting hospitals to talk with at-risk youth and shared my story with them with absolute transparency. I clearly told them that true success lay not in what the world valued, but in the ability to do good, to help selflessly, to live with a purpose. The older man could see in his eyes how those words reached the depths of their hearts, leaving them reflecting on the true meaning of life. However, I must admit that not everything was easy in the locker rooms and corridors of the football world. The pressure didn't stop. Some teammates began to mock me, saying that I was no longer the same person who had become a religious fanatic. At first, those words were painful, but I soon understood that I couldn't allow the opinions of others to define who I was. I knew perfectly well what I had experienced. I knew what God had shown me, and I was determined to faithfully follow that path regardless of what others might think. One day, I particularly remember an encounter with a former player renowned for his arrogance and hedonistic lifestyle. He looked at me with contempt and hurled a self-important phrase at me. "Do you really think that all this matters? Football is just a game. There's no room here for morality or God." Instead of responding angrily, I looked at him calmly and answered with absolute serenity. "To me, soccer is more than just a game, it's an opportunity to show others that there is something greater and more valuable than personal success." I immediately noticed an unexpected mix of surprise and curiosity appear on his face, as if my words had touched some forgotten corner of his heart. Significant changes also began to happen in my personal life. My family clearly perceived my transformation. I was no longer guided by my own selfish interests but rather motivated by a genuine desire to serve those around me. I began to dedicate more quality time to my loved ones, to be present for important moments, and to become the man God intended me to be. While sharing a quiet afternoon at home, my mother stared at me with a smile full of pride and tenderness. Then, in a soft, convincing voice, she said, "Son, I see clearly that you have found the true path." Those simple words had a deeper and more lasting impact on me than any trophy, medal, or public recognition I had ever received. Knowing that my transformation had been perceived and valued by the one I loved most was something that surpassed any earthly achievement. On another occasion, shortly after an intense match, a young teammate approached me in the locker room. His face reflected a deep sadness and lack of motivation, as if life had hit him hard and he didn't know where to turn. With a weak voice and a lost gaze, I asked myself, "How can I be like you? Where do you get that strength and that faith to remain steadfast despite everything that happens around you?" At first, I remained silent, searching for the right answer, but at that precise moment, I clearly remembered Jesus' words in Matthew 21:22, "Whatever you ask for in prayer, believing, you will receive it." Looking directly into his eyes, I responded simply, "It's not about being like me, it's all about believing in God, trusting Him completely, and resolutely following the path He has laid out especially for you." The young man nodded slowly, and for a brief moment, I felt deeply that perhaps that was precisely the purpose for which I had gone through all these trials. Every time this happened, I turned to the scriptures again, finding strength in each verse I read. I particularly remembered the words written in 2 Corinthians 12:9, "My grace is sufficient for you, for power is made perfect in weakness." It was as if God Himself were whispering in my ear, reminding me that even if my human strength faltered, His grace would always be sufficient to sustain me. Life continued its course at all times, but a radical and irreversible transformation had taken place within me. I no longer sought fame or success at any cost. The ego had ceased to dominate my decisions. My motivation now had deeper and more solid roots. With each passing day, I felt I better understood the true meaning of life. I clearly knew that my football career would come to an end, but my relationship with God was eternal and inexhaustible. Football was no longer my main purpose. The teachings I had received during that dark experience in hell, along with the experiences of my encounter with God, allowed me to see with absolute clarity what I truly had. Courage to help others, be a living example of faith, integrity, and goodness, and glorify God with each of my actions had definitely become my true purpose and mission. In one of the last interviews I gave, a journalist asked me how I had managed to overcome the countless obstacles that had arisen in my path. My answer came naturally and with absolute conviction. Only by the grace of God did I immediately notice how my words resonated in the hearts of those listening to me. At that precise moment, I understood that my testimony was infinitely more valuable and powerful than any trophy I had won over the years. My sports career began to approach its inevitable conclusion, but far from feeling sadness or emptiness, I experienced a deep inner peace. I knew perfectly well that although I would no longer be recognized as the famous soccer player I once was, I had discovered something much more valuable and lasting. My legacy would not be inscribed in trophies, titles, or medals, but in the transformed lives of the people to whom I had shown God's unconditional love. Looking back today, I recognize it was clear to me that the path I took was not easy, but it was undoubtedly the right one. No matter how many times the enemy tries to divert us from our purpose, I always remember the certainty written in Romans 8:31, "If God is for us, who can be against us?" The battle continues, and there will always be new trials. But now I know with absolute certainty that with God at my side, victory will always be possible. As my football career drew to a close, the memories of those dark moments in hell remain vividly present in my memory. Every time I faced some difficulty or challenge, my mind inevitably returned to that terrifying experience and the profound teaching I had received, that any success the world can offer is fleeting and empty compared to the eternal peace found only in Christ. Then I understood that my life had taken a direction that went far beyond football. That my purpose was just beginning and that its reach transcended the playing field. Fame, million-dollar contracts, and cameras had completely lost their meaning. I had come to the deep and firm conviction that absolutely nothing in this world could fill the void that only God has the power to fill. Even my teammates began to notice the transformation. I no longer participated in post-game celebrations or social gatherings. Instead, I preferred to return home to spend time in prayer, reading scripture, and constantly seeking divine direction for my life. One day, one of the most promising young men on the team approached me timidly and said, "I've been watching you for a while, and I noticed that something has changed profoundly in you. You're no longer like the others. What did you discover that others of us haven't been able to discover yet?" His gaze was intense, full of expectation, as if he longed for an answer that could completely transform his life at that moment. I clearly understood that my personal testimony, my own spiritual transformation, could have a much deeper impact than I had imagined. Looking into his eyes with complete sincerity, I replied, "What I have found is a peace that cannot be bought. You will not find it in millions of trophies or million-dollar contracts. True peace can only be found in an authentic relationship with God." I watched as his face lit up upon hearing these words. Although I couldn't be sure if they had reached the depths of his heart, I was absolutely certain that I had planted a seed of faith in him. From then on, I clearly understood that my mission was no longer limited solely to the sports arena. but that I was called to bear witness to the transforming power of God in my life. Every time someone asked me the secret of my success, I invariably responded with the same conviction: my success lies solely in the grace of God, not in something I no longer needed human recognition. The only recognition I truly longed for was that which came directly from God. Once, after retiring from professional football, a former coach of mine sought me out specifically to talk to me. With a sincere look and a voice full of curiosity, he said, "I've seen your interviews and heard you preach openly. I believe you really found something unique, something that others don't have. How did you manage to get there?" Staring at him, I answered clearly and simply, "It was God who changed my heart." It hasn't been easy, but when you fully surrender your life to Him, everything changes. I saw the constant questions I was asked about my spiritual transformation as valuable opportunities to share my faith. I understood then that football had simply been an initial platform, but that my true platform was my entire life, through which I could bear living and constant witness to God's powerful work in me. However, it wasn't always easy. Some former colleagues continued to consider religion to be merely a weakness or a way of escape from the difficulties of life. They often tried to test me with sarcastic or derogatory comments. To this, I always responded calmly, accompanied by a serene smile. I was aware that my faith did not depend on the acceptance or approval of others. Over time, I began to actively collaborate with various Christian organizations, using my fame and recognition to raise funds for those most in